Hello, thanks for tuning in to my presentation for EASPM 2020 London Calling. My name is Maria Perevedentseva, and in this talk I'll be analysing the language used to describe electronic dance music releases on the online record store Boomkat in order to identify genre-specific discursive tropes and explore how the language used maps onto the acoustic features of the music in question. As we know, music fans of all stripes often develop sophisticated language in order to differentiate and discuss their music of choice and themselves as fans. I'd like to begin by playing a short clip from an iconic record store scene from the 1999 film Human Traffic, which neatly captures the specificity of this discursive self-positioning and the centrality of the record store to it.
Yo, what's up?
Hey, nice.
Any new hip-hop, man?
Yeah. Hey, I got some smoking West Coast flow, just landed raw as botulism, mate.
Nah, fuck that West Coast shit, man. I want some hardcore East Coast flavor beat, you know what I mean?
Well, why didn't you say so? Fat beats, Armageddon on the streets. We're inundated with the shit, bro. Hey, if we had any more hardcore, we get arrested, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, firstly, we can see that the language used is highly specialised, technical, and scene-specific. Secondly, the record store is presented as a social site of knowledge exchange, and there's a performative dimension to it. The store curates what is musically worthwhile in a particular scene and supports a distinctive set of knowledge, practices, and expertise which are negotiated between its staff and its customers. Thirdly, the words used to describe the sound or the vibe of the music are highly evocative and metaphorical, for example, smoking flow or beats as raw as botulism. And they belie certain value systems and aesthetic ideals that are specific to this kind of music. We don't have time to watch the whole clip, but later in the scene, once the hip-hop customer has bought a record and left, two jungle fans arrive and ask for recommendations, and the store clerk taps into a different discursive genre in order to suggest records to them, appeal to their musical expertise, and showcase his. Therefore, even closely related musical genres like jungle and hip-hop have noticeably different discursive trademarks, which presumably reflect the musical and socio-cultural differences between the two genres. With these observations as starting points, I wanted to analyse the record release blurbs on boomkat.com, which is an independent, online-only record retailer renowned internationally for its left-of-centre selection of ambient, experimental and electronic dance music, and for its creative use of language in its product descriptions. Like Berlin's Hardwax store, Boomkat is considered a real destination for and authority on these types of music. I've been a Boomkat customer for years and have always found their record release blurbs to be funny, informative, and very precisely evocative of the sounds of the records that they are describing. These are descriptions that make sense to me as a fan of electronic dance music, hereafter EDM, in the sense that when I read the words Van Halen levels of noodle acid riffage in this review of the new Square Pusher album, I feel like I have a clear idea of what that sounds like. Apart from press releases written by record labels, Boomkat's release blurbs are often the first proper critical statements on a release, setting the discursive agenda that magazines and fans then respond to. Besides partaking in the discourse characteristics of EDM culture more broadly, Boomkat's discursive style also employs several compensatory strategies, by which I mean things like specialised terms, slang, expressive misspellings, and so on, in order to recreate the sense of intimacy, sociality, and musical expertise that would be sought in a physical record store experience. These also enable Boomkat to signal insider knowledge to its regulars and uphold what Bartmansky and Woodward have called the golden standard of a record store run by music fans for music fans, with all the connotations of exclusivity that brings. Unlike existing work which focuses on user-generated language in EDM blog posts and social media comments, Boomkat presents an interesting case study for discourse analysis because, like magazines and other formal media outlets, it serves as a textual, authoritative and public-facing barometer of EDM culture and attitude. However, Boomkat is also a shop and therefore a setting where musical products are literally conferred value through the purchase of records. And unlike magazines and blogs, its product reviews are written anonymously and with the explicit intention to sell. Without the accountability and scrutiny of authored reviews, I believe that analysing the discursive characteristics of Boomcat's product descriptions could shed some light on the concealed inflections of taste latent in EDM culture, the sorts of things that a retailer knows its customers want, whether they themselves realise it or not. With the background dealt with, I'll now discuss my principal methodology. For this study, I used a mixture of computational, qualitative and quantitative methods to analyse the blurbs for records filed by Boomcat under the grime forward, jungle footwork and techno house categories. These genre categories are designed by Boomcat, and each of them combines two genres which are related only by BPM, it's beats per minute. My research questions were, firstly, to see what sorts of discursive tropes or themes I could detect among and between the genres. Secondly, to compare their relative weighting. And thirdly, I wanted to see whether and how the very poetic verbal descriptions used in the blurbs correlated with acoustic features in the tracks they were describing. I'll detail the methods I used to try to answer the first two questions now and deal with the third question when we get to it later on. In practical terms, I scraped 1 year's worth of release data. In total, there were 1,276 releases which had blurbs between the three genres, and as you can see on the slide, the grime and jungle genres had considerably fewer releases than techno. Then, using the Voyant open source text analysis environment, I did content frequency analysis on the release blurbs and retained all terms which appear 4 or more times in each genre category. Then I had to categorize the terms into tropes to see what kinds of musical and other issues were foregrounded in the discourse around each genre. At this point, computational methods became somewhat redundant and I had to go old school. Natural language processing has come a long way in the last few years, but as we've been discussing, the language used in EDM context is in many ways unnatural and highly context-specific, so NLP can't quite capture the nuances that an insider can. Therefore, I had to manually categorize all individual terms, or types in linguistics parlance, across the three genre corpora, and then work out the percentages and distributions of them, and so on. The trope categories themselves were arrived at inductively, in the sense that I went through the lists and used the context tool in Voyant to see what the words were referring to. In the end, I settled for 12 trope categories, which you can see on the slide. Trope 7, references to affective tonality, is the most vague but also most interesting trope because it contains highly poetic and evocative language that refers to non-specific aspects of the overall feel of the music. I'll talk more about this category in a minute, but the term affective tonality is borrowed from Brian Masumi, who himself takes it from Daniel Stern. Assigning the terms into trope categories wasn't an easy process because so many of the words are polysemic. The word rave, for example, which appears in all three genre corpora, can refer to a place, the rave, a time period, the rave era, a musical style, a sound, rave synths, or an affective tonality, i.e. that was a total rave. Therefore, I was heavily reliant on my situated insider knowledge and the context tool in Voyant, and in the end assigned rave to different trope categories in each genre. All of this is to say that this isn't an exact science and requires a good deal of researcher discretion. With the sound, timbre and rhythm meter categories, I only wanted to include terms that were indisputably references to specific instrumental sound qualities and not the overall texture of the track, or to aspects of rhythm, meter and speed. If there was any ambiguity, in spite of myself, I categorized these words as referring to affective tonality. And I say in spite of myself because my main research interests is timbre, and one of my initial motivations for doing this project was to find out the relative weightings between timbre and rhythm in EDM discourse. So, of course, I wanted timbre to win this race. But in the end, words like lush, which in my head and in my experience of various EDM discourse communities, would certainly refer to a rich, resonant and mid-range heavy string pad or cymbal timbre. They were assigned as belonging to the affect trope. So let's look at some results now. Here's a chart that compares the weighting of all tropes except for miscellaneous for the three genre categories. The orange bars are for grime forward, yellow for jungle footwork, and green for techno house. This chart is based on the percentages of tokens rather than percentages of individual word forms, because I think that gives a better representation of the distribution of the tropes. The first thing that stands out is that trope 7, affective tonality, is by far the most populous in all three genre categories, but especially in techno house. On the surface then, this would appear to confirm that house really is just a feeling, and corroborate the large body of literature on EDM that portrays pre-rational affectivity as a distinguishing feature of rave music and culture. I say on the surface because, as I'll discuss later, I believe a lot of these non-specific affective terms in fact denote fairly specific musical features. The next thing that stands out is that jungle footwork is the sole genre category in which rhythm and meter are invoked more frequently than sound and timbre. This makes sense on an intuitive level because of how important rhythmic programming, speed and so on are to both of those genres' aesthetic DNA. But it is striking that overall, this trope is not one of the most prevalent across all three genre categories, despite rhythm and meter being often cited as the raison d'etre of EDM. Because there isn't time to go through each corpus in detail in this presentation, on this slide I've given the top 10 terms per trope in each genre category so you can get some idea of the variations between them. Of course, the lower down the frequency rate you go, the more interesting the language becomes, but this will have to do for now. One thing to note here is that the word like is consistently one of the most frequently used terms in each corpus. This underscores yet again the reliance of vernacular pop music discourse on metaphors and metonymy, and to me signals the need for the development of a systematic music analytical language for pop that could address its own aesthetic priorities. Other things these results show are that, as observed by Paul Teberge, with reference to other pop music genres, EDM discourse similarly privileges what would normally be negatively valenced terms like dark, rough, pressure, etc. There's also a recurring motif of transformation, mutation, hybrids, and other signifiers of changing states, which Gabrielson and Wick, in their classic study, identified as being an important element of reported strong experiences of music. Lastly, the prevalence of words like bullet, shot, killer, weapon, etc. resonate with Tara Rogers' observations on the centrality of military imagery in the broader discourse of electronic music, which she believes contributes to the discursive and lived exclusion of women from the field. So I now want to move on and look in detail at the affect trope. Here are the top 46 terms from each genre category that I classified as referring to affective tonality. Within this trope, it's possible to pick out several subtropes. For example, many of the terms seem to refer to force, energy, and motion, words such as pressure, torque, flow, percolated, swagger, and so on. Others refer to colour and light, and others to temperature. There are also stylistic references that I thought were too non-specific to go in the main genre trope. References to altered consciousness and references to emotional affect. Also, there are references to texture, so words like stripped, hard, raw, rugged. References to mass, dense, pendulous, weightless, and then some miscellaneous terms like feminine, smart, direct, and so on. Many of these subtropes exhibit all the hallmarks of the kind of image schemata and metaphorical cross-domain projection that have guided various theories of embodied cognition over the last few decades. Furthermore, they are also consistent with many of the semantic factors that have been derived from studies of the language used to describe timbre in various discourse communities. In their review of this literature, Wallmark and Kendall identified texture, mass, and luminance as especially prominent tropes, along with the prevalence of verbal adjectives, as well as noting that timbral vocabulary is often affectively loaded and can be classified in terms of valence, energy arousal, and implied tension. As we can see from the terms on my lists, the overall theme here is of high tension and high energy arousal, corresponding with EDM's valuing of vitality and an aestheticized acoustic extremism. With this in mind, I can move on to the third and final question that guides this paper. How do these commonly used affective descriptors correlate with the acoustic features of the tracks they're describing, if at all? As a timbre researcher, I was especially keen to find timbre correlates to my word of choice. So going through my Trope 7 lists, I wanted to find a word that has connotations of mass, texture, energy arousal, and all the other factors we were just talking about. I settled on the word talk because it always stood out to me when I was categorizing, and because it appears only 31 times in relation to specific tracks in my genre corpora, so that was a feasible amount to have to work through. Torque, as I'm sure you know, is defined as a force that tends to cause rotation or a twisting force. In terms of embodied schema, we can say that the word relies on the perception of a downward force and a sideways rotary motion. To me at least, it also has a haptic dimension, being associated with grinding. In the word embedding visualization on the slide, you can see some of the other words from Trope 7 in the techno house corpus that Torque is semantically close with. Pressure, power, traction, grinder, angular, and so on. All of these words will have more of their own cross-modal correspondences, which are based on our individual embodied experiences. And my method was simple: to find tracks that use Torque in their descriptions and listen to them with the aid of spectrograms to see what acoustic features they share. Simon Zagorski-Thomas's work on sonic cartoons was instructive here, as I was effectively reverse engineering the process by attempting to identify sounds from the cross-modal conceptual metaphors that were used to describe them. In this table, you can see information about the tracks from all three genre corpora which use Torque in their descriptions. Those highlighted in bold are tracks which share a timbral feature, which I believe corresponds with Torque as a descriptor. The spectromorphological features these timbral gestures have in common included a busy mid-range frequency content, doubled by strong sub-bass, which, according to Dennis Smalley, perceptually extends the depth of the sound, thereby corresponding with the downward force associated with Torque. They also had a dynamic temporal envelope, achieved by various combinations of amplitude, pitch, and filter envelope modulation. The overall effect was of a dilation, an opening up, or a detuning, all of which correspond to the rotary or twisting aspect of Torque as a physical action. And the third thing they shared in common was a complex and resonant, sawtooth-like harmonic spectrum, along with often prominent distortion and increased inharmonicity near the onset of the gesture, thus aligning cross-modally with the grinding aspect of Torque, which implies noise, high frequencies, and so on. The not insignificant proportion of tracks listed that do not contain this timbral gesture do, however, exhibit some features that could correlate with the perceptual invariance of the word Torque, mostly in terms of sub-bass pressure and its attendant downward force. However, this type of gesture is so ubiquitous in electronic dance music that I felt a term so specific as Torque could not reasonably be correlated with that in this instance. Here are two short audio excerpts along with spectrograms so you can get a sense of what this sounds like. I'm sure that recording through my laptop speakers will cancel out the sub-bass, so please just trust the red frequency bands at the bottom of the spectrograms to tell you that it's very high amplitude and very powerful. So here is Motu Screwball. And here's Bamboo Man Ricochet, the Matthew Herbert remix. Okay, I hope you can hear the similarities between these excerpts and how they correspond to the perceptual invariance of Torque as an embodied action. The downward pull, I think, is very clear, and you can see the vast space that exists between the sub-bass parts and the top lines in both tracks, which gives this sensation of downward pull and space. Likewise, I hope you can hear the inharmonicity and dynamism. To me, they both capture the sense of twisting, grinding, and swerving inherent to Torque. And interestingly, a similar gesture also appears in a 1997 track called Torque by Ed Rush and Nico. So it's possible that the Boomcat writers applying this term to sound gestures like these could be a semi-conscious intertextual reference to this older classic track, in a similar way that dread and Reese basslines have become known as types in the last 20 years. To sum up, in this paper I adopted a three-pronged approach to analyse the language used on boomkat.com in order to identify and compare genre-specific discursive tropes in electronic dance music. My results show that Boomkat's language is consistent with wider international EDM discourse and operates in a symbiotic relationship with fan discourses. The tropes I identified are differently weighted across the three genre corpora, broadly reflecting the different aesthetic priorities and sociocultural histories of those genres. References to affective tonality were the most common across all three genre categories. Surprisingly, references to rhythm and meter were less prominent than expected for EDM as a metagenre, and references to timbre were more prevalent than those to rhythm in the grime forward and techno house corpora. Furthermore, the subtropes identified within references to affective tonality exhibit embodied characteristics associated with image schemata and conceptual metaphors in theories of embodied cognition. Individual terms within this trope are also consistent with the language used to describe timbre across a variety of popular and classical music discourses. My attempt to map the verbal descriptor talk onto the music showed a clear correspondence between the perceptual invariance implied by the term and the timbral features of the music in question. However, this is still something of an agnostic conclusion, in the sense that there's not enough evidence to disprove it, nor enough to conclusively prove it. Therefore, more research is needed to try to pinpoint the acoustic properties that terms like these refer to. Finally, the fact that this word talk is likely a representation of timbral features corroborates Cornelia Fails's observation that EDM listeners have developed an advanced perceptual acuity for hearing timbre, a musical phenomenon that is notoriously slippery. In this context specifically, timbre and its descriptions appear to circulate as a kind of subcultural currency, contributing to the valuation of the records they appear in. Perhaps then, the frequent invocation of EDM's explicitly non-cognitive affectivity as being the defining feature of the genre's appeal for listeners could be a side effect of those previous studies having not recognized what are actually fairly specific timbral underpinnings to the whimsical vernacular language used to communicate about EDM by fans. Unfortunately, as I think we are out of time, this larger question will have to remain open until a later date. Thank you very much for listening. I'd be grateful for any questions or feedback you may have. My email address is given on the slide there. Thank you.